Hello and welcome to my channel. Here's some African wildlife in colored pencil. There's a nice contrast in color temperature on this hyena because some parts of its body are catching some warm light from the sunset while the rest of it is in the shadow. It should be interesting. Let's get to it. First we're going to do the sketch, but before I get on with that I'm going to say a few words about the materials. I'm working with Faber Castell Polychromos colored pencils on 1000 grit sandpaper. The size is about 9 × 11 inches. I'm going to do the initial sketch with a couple of different colors because I want the outline at the top and on the left to be a little bit brighter, and I'm going to use some cadmium orange for that because I want that to be warmer and lighter because it's facing the light source and it's catching some light, while the rest of the animal is going to be in the shadow, and I'm mostly going to use some cooler colors there, but I'm going to get to that later. First, a little bit of sketching. Like I said, this is 1000 grit sandpaper, so there's going to be a lot of layering, and I'm going to be able to work both from light to dark and from dark to light, which is very important when you're drawing wildlife. There's lots of details like the fur and other stuff, and it's very useful if you're able to add lighter details on top of the darker layers. So I'm starting with the background here, and first I'm going to put in some darker values in there. The background is going to be an out of focus bokeh background, which means that there's going to be some suggestions of shapes and colors, but no specific shapes or anything like that. And the background at the top is mostly going to be green, like maybe there are some trees and bushes there, and then the midground and the foreground area is going to be dull brownish and golden yellow, like the savanna. There's going to be a bit of a transition here, which is why I'm going to add some touches of green in that middle portion of the paper as well, but then I'm going to add a lot more of it at the top. I'm mostly going to use chromium oxide green, a dark green for the background there, but I also decided to put in a few touches of this light ultramarine just to have some bluish tones as well. After that I did a lot of blending. There are some parts of this process which are a bit repetitive and which take a bit more time. Blending with colored pencils is very difficult if you're not using solvents, and I never use solvents. On regular paper it's very difficult, almost impossible. On sanded paper it's actually much easier because the textured surface, the rough surface, grinds on the pencil and creates a little bit of residue to work with, so it's easier to move that color around. But it's still not as easy as it would be, for example, with pastel pencils or pastels. But it can be blended, and these shapes can be softened, and it can be made to look smoother. It just takes a few more minutes, and it takes a little bit more patience. But eventually I will get there. So right now I'm doing a lot of blending, and I'm trying to create that out of focus background, because in the background here it's important to avoid having texture because I don't want it to be distracting. The main subject, the hyena itself, is going to have a lot of detail and texture, and that's one of the things that's going to help it stand out against the background. Also, some parts of the background which are closer to our viewpoint, which are closer to the foreground, are going to be more detailed and textured. I'm going to have some blades of grass popping into the view. Obviously there I'm going to allow a bit more detail and texture, but for the most part the background around the animal is going to be kind of blurry and with not too much detail. And moving on with the main subject, starting to put in some darker details. I started with the nose here, and then this transition between the forehead and the snout. You may notice that I already put in a little bit of bluish color here on the shadow side of the ear. It's not going to remain quite like that, but it is going to be a slightly cooler color. And now I also added a little bit of texture to it. I still haven't started drawing those highlights yet. That should be interesting. In fact, that was one of the things that drew me to this picture. And now I'm starting to put in those warm colors around the edge of the animal's head. So the light source is coming sort of from behind, and the edges of the fur are catching that light, but the light source is coming more from the left, which is why there's going to be a little bit more shadow on the right side. Now, it's impossible to get the exact color you want just with one pencil. So the great thing about this sanded surface is that I can apply lighter pencils on top of one another and darker pencils on top of them as well. And I can sort of blend even these highlights. So I added some yellowish orange highlights there, and when in those places where I felt like they needed to be even lighter, I simply added a touch of ivory colored pencil, which is like a yellowish white. And that did the trick, because that allowed me to make some of those hairs on that light side of the fur even lighter. Now here around the nose and the snout we have some bluish tones. So as I've already mentioned, there are some very interesting contrasts here in this drawing, because you're going to have contrast not just in value and texture, you're also going to have a contrast in color temperature. All of these are very important for realistic drawings, because they will help us convey not just the shape of the animal, but how it interacts with the light source. So I did the eye here, leaving a little bit of space for that catch light in the eye, except for the fact that this catch light is going to be kind of grayish and mostly subdued, because it's all in the shadow. Now initially I didn't really know what to do with this short hair around the snout and the head, because it's sometimes a little bit difficult to imitate that appearance of very short fur. I mean, I don't really feel like drawing every single hair, and sometimes I'm unable to produce the texture I want just by dragging my pencil or allowing the pencil to work for me, as I often do. So here I had to do something in between. I had to allow the pencil to create at least a little bit of texture, and then refine it by adding some smaller, finer marks. Because when you're drawing animal fur, there are a couple of things to remember. You have to pay attention to the length of the fur and the direction of the fur, and you will see that the length of the fur varies depending on the part of the animal's body. Here around the head and the snout, it's usually very short, which is why you have to add very short marks, almost like dots. And that's sort of what I did, and some of them were obviously lighter than the others, so I had to put in some lighter blues as well as some darker blues, and even some black, obviously, as my base color, because most of it is very dark and in the shadow. Now these highlights here, these lighter hairs on the mouth and the snout area, are also yellowy orange, but they are a little bit darker with a little bit more red in them. So I added a touch of some reddish tones in there, and obviously I made them a little bit darker than the ones at the top because the light source is coming from above, so the ears are obviously going to be catching a bit more light than some of the lower parts of the head. So I've moved on to the other ear, did some of the darker or the shadow areas, and now I'm putting in some lighter marks for the fur. I switched to a slightly lighter dark pencil here. This is a dark sepia, and I realized that this one will do pretty well for the darker details on the fur, in combination with the black, of course, because the dark sepia is kind of like a dull dark brown. Well, it's not exactly dull. I don't really know how to describe it, but it's a very dark brown, and this is sort of what I needed, because when you look at the hyena's fur, sometimes, depending on the lighting, it seems a little bit warmer and more yellowish brown. Sometimes they're kind of more grayish, duller brown. But here, especially because of the lighting and because most of it is in the shadow, we're going to have a lot more of those duller, darker, grayish tones. So I'm going to use a combination of these darker pencils to create that texture, and I'm going to work on top of that with lighter pencils. Here I'm using a bit of this lighter blue, because some parts of the fur on the head are a bit lighter, but they're still in the shadow, so I'm making them cooler and obviously making them darker than the highlights on the light side of the head, or that lighter edge around the head. So I have to say, for the most part, this was a very challenging drawing. The reason why it was so challenging was because there are so many interesting colors in there, and you often kind of wonder how exactly am I going to get to the color that I want. And the fur is very complex. There are many different variations in color and value in there. Plus, you have the fact that there's this contrast between the light side and the shadow side, and it's kind of difficult to interpret what all of these details and colors mean. So for me, it was a bit of a challenging drawing, I have to say. But I always try to find ways to simplify it and to make it simpler for me, because if I can't really understand what's going on, then it's going to be very difficult for me to explain to the viewer what I see, and I have to use my pencils and my colors to explain what I see, and if I'm not interpreting what I see very well, then it's not going to make a lot of sense. But here the key thing was establishing that contrast between the light side and the shadow side, and also making the sense out of all that fur in the shadow side, because the largest portion of this body of our main subject here is in the shadow. Here I switched to working a little bit on this background area, adding some golden yellowish and some raw umber tones, but then I also added some darker brown in between those, because I needed to have some of those deeper shadow areas, so that I would add a bit more depth to that grass, because I don't want it to look flat. I want my scene to have a little bit of depth, and I had to add some of those darker areas in first. I mostly used walnut brown and then a bit of dark sepia, and then I worked over that with raw umber and golden yellow or something like that, and then I worked on top of that with some lighter pencils. But the color I've established here is a little bit darker and duller. Now I'm going to start adding some lighter details on top of that. Now the details of these lighter blades of grass in the background there, I want them to be a lot less defined and a lot more blurry. And as we approach the foreground, or as we approach our viewpoint, I want them to be more and more defined in terms of their shapes. So I'm going to be pulling some cleaner marks as I approach the foreground, and I'm even going to be working around them with my pencil, drawing a little bit of shadow around them on the side, which I believe should be facing away from the light source. This is all a part of the background, so obviously it's not the focus of my drawing or my video here, but I just want to explain my approach here. And let me just also say which pencil I use. I actually use this light warm grey for the most part, because I felt that it had a bit of a warmer yellowish component to it, but it worked well with other colors which I laid down as the base color. So I think it works for the background here. So I kept adding some details here and there just to make that grass a bit more interesting. And once I had done that left side of the background, I was ready to move on with the rest of the main subject, because I like to work in a certain order most of the time. Most of the time I work from top to bottom and from left to right, because I'm right-handed. Now on this surface, colored pencils, they do smudge a little bit. On regular paper they hardly smudge at all. Here they can be smudged a bit, but it's not too bad. I could still rest my hand on the drawing and not make too much of a mess, but I try to be cautious and to work in a certain order as much as possible. I'm going to be using a little bit of the light warm grey here in the shadow side as well, because the shadow side has some warmer tones such as warm grey and some brown and even some raw umber. I've already added those in, but it also has some bluish tones here and there. One of the things I kept doing to kind of make things simpler for me was I would draw some of these darker spots and stripes, whatever it is that hyenas have, and then I would sort of work around them, because placing those larger darker areas kind of helped me navigate through the rest of the body. It helped me relax and it helped me understand where I am, because you obviously have to pay attention to the anatomy, but it's easier to do that when you have some reference points, and these spots, if I place them correctly, I know where I am, because they also follow the shape of the body, because they're a part of the fur, and the fur of course is a part of the body because it bends and twists around the parts of the body where the body bends and twists. So these shapes, these darker shapes of those spots are also very important for me, because they help me understand the anatomy of the body and navigate through the drawing of the entire body more easily. This top of the head here has like a mane. I don't really know what it's called, but I suppose it is like a short mane on the hyena's neck, and I tried to make that look a little bit fluffier by adding some longer marks. Remember what I told you about drawing fur? You have to pay attention to the length of the fur, so if the fur is shorter, you have to make shorter marks. If the fur is longer, you have to make longer marks. If the fur is softer and fluffier, you have to try to soften it, either by applying some lighter colors on top of the darker ones, or even using some blending tools. And I used some tortillions here. Let me say a few words about that, because I use homemade tortillions and they work pretty well as blending tools on this sanded surface. And one of the things I like to do, I like to have many of them at my disposal, because they get muddied, they pick up a little bit of color, and I don't want to muddy the colors or mix them up, so I always like to have at least 4 or 5 tortillons at hand. And of course, in addition to them, I'm also going to use some brushes here and there. So there are also some highlights here on this side of the neck to the right. The mane is catching some light from the light source. Here I can do a little bit of the background on the right side because I've done most of the head and the neck, so I'm going to do a little bit of the background here before I move on to the rest of the body. And you can see that here I'm doing a bit of blending with my brush and even my finger here and there, and if you find that surprising, that's because you can do that actually on this surface because it's easier to move the colors, to move that pigment on a sanded surface. So now I'm going to move on with the rest of the body, and like I said, I decided to put in at least some of those darker spots first because that would help me work on the rest of the details later. And the reason why I can put in some of these darker details so boldly is because I know that my surface can take many layers, and if I want to modify the shape of those spots, I can easily do that by adding some lighter marks on top of them, because this surface, this 1000 grit sandpaper, takes many layers, and I can easily work with lighter pencils on top of the darker ones. You can see here that I'm using some lighter warm gray on top of some of the brownish marks which I established, and this I feel is a much more natural way to work when you're drawing things like fur or grass or complex things like that, because it allows you to put in the darker or the shadow areas first and then put those lighter details on top, because when you think about it, it makes sense, because those layers of the fur which are deeper in the shadow, they're further down or further away from the light source, and those hairs or clumps of hair which are sticking out, they're going to be lighter. So it's only natural for me to draw the darker shapes first, or the darker fur first, and then add lighter and lighter clumps on top of that. On regular paper I can't really do that. On sanded paper I can do that with ease. And if I were working on regular paper, I would have to find ways to imitate that appearance and texture of the fur, but it wouldn't be easy, and I wouldn't be able to achieve this exact look. This way I can imitate the appearance of the fur very closely. Now I had a little bit of trouble with this, with these highlights on the left side of the animal's body, on the chest and the shoulder area, whatever it is, because it was a little bit difficult for me to get the right color. I started with a little bit of orange and then added some yellowish tones and added a touch of red and some others as well. But this right side, which is facing away from the light source, is going to be considerably cooler and darker, although the edge of the body to the right is also going to be catching some light, which is why I added some lighter grey there. So I'm continuing to draw some of these darker spots, and it seems to me that the further down the back I go, the larger and larger they're getting, and the more they look like sort of short stripes rather than spots, so I don't really know what to call them. Now, one of the things that I like to do with them is I like to draw almost like these irregular blobs of dark color, and then I refine their shape a little bit later so that they look like their actual fur. So I add a little bit of texture and those short hairs to them later, but I will also refine their shape and appearance by adding lighter marks or lighter furs on top of them. So here we're going to have some shadow around the hind legs and between the legs and the tail, but I'm going to get to that later. Here at the top of the back, behind the neck, there is a patch of darker brownish fur. So I used a bit more of the walnut brown and the dark sepia for that, and I used dark sepia for those darker marks on the fur for much of the fur on the back, and I also used it to create that transition between those darker spots, which I mostly did with a black colored pencil, and the lighter fur, which is mostly kind of dull grayish brown or just gray, or that's the way it appears here. Now for the lighter marks here, you can see that I'm using this light warm gray again, but I am using that on top of the darker layers again. So again, with the fur, most of the time I'm working from dark to light, which is what I prefer to do when I'm drawing fur in this technique. But there are occasionally a few marks which I will add with a darker pencil here and there, just to maybe add a little bit more shadow in between some clumps of fur to create an illusion of depth or maybe some thickness of fur and things like that. This part of the fur here around the legs and the side of the body is a little bit confusing, mostly because the colors are getting a little bit duller and this part of the body is getting a bit obscured by some of the blades of grass which are going over the over that part of the body, or they're in front of that part of the body. But you can see how I, with these highlights, if I don't get the right color immediately, I can always go over it with some other color and maybe modify it slightly. The thing is that on this surface, by controlling the amount of pressure and the amount of pigment you put down, you can create different kinds of effects. So if you want a clean mark, you can do that, but if you want to just kind of glaze over a layer, you can do that by using less pressure, and that way you just modify the color a little bit. This is because on this rough surface, sanded surface, I feel like colored pencils actually do blend, but on regular paper you would just have to layer them and to try to create that illusion of blending, which doesn't always work quite as well. That is one of the reasons why I've preferred sanded paper over the regular paper for quite some time now. And of course, if you can get artist quality sanded papers, that would be even better, but I find that these hardware store 1000 grit wet dry sandpapers actually do a very, very good job, and they're virtually indestructible, so it's actually a very good drawing medium. And they work well in combination with Faber Castell Polychromos colored pencils, because they are a little bit harder and they last longer and they hold the tip a little bit better than maybe some of the other softer brands, because I feel like this surface would maybe eat through some of them a little bit too quickly. Now if you look at this part of the side of the body, it's catching some light here, and that's why I made it a little bit lighter and used some warmer colors there. But the head and the neck is also casting a shadow on the top of the back. That's why the rest of it is darker. So there are some interesting shadows here and an interesting contrast between some parts of the body which are catching light from that warm light source and others which are in the shadow. Whenever you have things like that in your reference photos, you should try to use it as much as possible. You should try to use those shadows because they really help you give more volume and depth to whatever it is that you're trying to draw. I'm just working on the tail here, modifying the shape of the hair here, and now I'm going to do a little bit more of the blending with a brush. I'm using a soft synthetic brush to soften some of these darker marks, because I want to make the fur here a bit darker, and I also want to soften the texture of the fur a little bit. The reason why I want to do that is because I want to have less texture here on this part of the body. I want to make it look like the focus is on the animal's head. The rest of it is going to be just a tiny bit out of focus. I'm also adding a touch of Prussian blue to some of the shadow areas. I already used that and the light ultramarine to add some of the bluish tones to the shadow areas. So we have an interesting combination of warmer and cooler colors. Now I'm refining the appearance of the fur in this shadow area, and I feel like this part here is a bit simpler now that I've already established some of the larger contrasts, and now that I have all of these darker spots in place. I think my main challenge were those lighter areas of warmer color. Normally when you draw, you should try to define those larger relationships first, but sometimes I feel like when a subject is this complex with so many details, it's easier for me to work segment by segment, but I still more or less do the same thing by trying to establish some of those larger darker or lighter areas and then add some details on top. And this is where this surface really comes in handy, because it allows you to add those lighter details. Sometimes it feels almost infinitely, as long as you don't use too much pressure and as long as you don't put down too much of the material or don't grind down too much with your blending tools, you can actually add quite a few of those layers. Still working with some bluish tones here, adding some blue to the shadow side, and now again adding some darker blue with this darker Prussian blue, especially around the edges of these darker spots. This will further enhance that contrast between the warmer light side and the darker shadow side, or cooler shadow side. And now all I have left to do is finish the rest of the background here in the corner and on the right. I'm going to use the same approach. I'm going to use some of those yellowish and brownish tones, add a little bit of brown here and there to add more depth, and then add a bit of warm grey for those longer stalks or blades of grass, whatever they are. Blend them a bit more at around the middle, where the grass is a little bit further away, and then just add a few refining touches here and there so that the body of the hyena would stand out better against the background. The drawing is almost done. If you like my videos, don't forget to give me a like, comment and subscribe. And if you want to see longer videos, much more content and full-length narrated videos, you should check out my Patreon. I'm just going to put my signature here in the lower left corner. So now the drawing is done. I hope you like this colored pencil drawing of a hyena. I'm going to see you in the next video. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.